In the summer of 1885, Lizzie O'Leary's neighbors in Boston spoke of her as a quiet woman, devoted to her 2 young children and the modest home they kept. On an August morning, their door stayed closed far too long. By midday, someone forced it open, and inside lay a silence that would not lift. Lizzie and her children would never speak again. Let us know which country or state you are listening from. Our voices travel farther than Boston streets ever could. Lizzie O'Leary's house sat at the end of a narrow lane, its clapboard siding faded by years of sun and rain. The garden was small but tidy, a patch of green where her children, Nora and James, played in the afternoons. Lizzie kept her curtains drawn in the early hours, letting in only as much light as she wished. She was not unfriendly, but she was careful. Her words measured, her smiles reserved for those she trusted. Each morning, Lizzie rose before dawn. The sound of her footsteps on the kitchen floor was a comfort to her children, who would wake to the smell of porridge and the soft clatter of dishes. Nora, the elder, was 6, with a quiet seriousness that mirrored her mother's. James, just 4, was more restless, his laughter quick to rise and just as quick to vanish. Lizzie would dress them both with gentle hands, smoothing their hair, tying their shoes, her touch lingering as if to shield them from the world outside. Neighbors saw the O'Learys most often at the market, Lizzie's hand resting lightly on Nora's shoulder, James trailing close behind. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. She would nod to Mrs. Callahan, who lived 2 doors down, or offer a soft word to Mr. Doyle, the grocer, but she never lingered. Her errands were done with purpose, her children always within reach. The O'Leary home was not large, but it was orderly. Lizzie kept the parlor swept, the kitchen neat, the children's toys gathered in a wooden box by the hearth. In the evenings, she would read to Nora and James by lamplight, her voice low and steady. The children pressed close on either side. Sometimes a boarder would join them, a quiet man named Mr. Hanley, who rented the small room at the back. He was polite, if distant, and Lizzie treated him with the same careful courtesy she offered everyone. On the last morning they were seen alive. The O'Leary house was much as it always was. Lizzie was up before the sun, her silhouette moving behind the kitchen window. Nora and James played in the yard, their voices soft, their games gentle. Mrs. Callahan, passing on her way to the bakery, waved to Lizzie, who nodded in return, her face calm, her eyes shadowed by the brim of her bonnet. Mr. Hanley left early, as he often did, his footsteps quiet on the path. He paused at the gate, glancing back at the house, then disappeared down the lane. Lizzie watched him go, her expression unreadable. She closed the door behind her, the latch clicking softly. Inside, the morning unfolded in small, familiar rituals. Lizzie poured milk for the children, wiped crumbs from the table, folded a clean cloth over the bread. Nora helped her mother, her small hands careful and precise. James sat on the floor, building towers from wooden blocks, his brow furrowed in concentration. The hours passed quietly. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the yard. The O'Leary house remained still, its windows closed, its door untouched. Neighbors went about their business, glancing now and then at the silent house, but thinking little of it. Lizzie was a private woman, and it was not unusual for her to keep to herself. But as the morning wore on, a sense of unease began to settle. Mrs. Callahan, returning from the bakery, noticed that the curtains had not been drawn back. Mr. Doyle, delivering a parcel, found the gate still latched, the path unswept. The children's laughter, so often heard in the yard, was absent. By midday, the silence had grown heavy. Mrs. Callahan stood at her own window watching the O'Leary house, her hands twisting in her apron. She told herself there was nothing to worry about, that Lizzie was simply resting, that the children were napping. But the quiet pressed in thick and unnatural, and she could not look away. Inside the O'Leary home, the morning's routines had ended. The rooms were still, the air unmoving. The last sounds had faded, leaving only the hush that comes when something has gone terribly wrong. The neighbors did not yet know it, but the O'Leary family's story had already ended. All that remained was the silence, waiting to be broken. The silence around the O'Leary house grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. Mrs. Callahan watched from her window, her unease sharpening with every hour that passed. She saw no movement behind the curtains, no sign of Lizzie or the children in the yard. The gate remained closed, the path undisturbed. She tried to busy herself with chores, but her eyes kept drifting back to the quiet house at the end of the lane. By 2 o'clock, the worry had become too much to ignore. Mrs. Callahan wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, the sun hot on her shoulders. She crossed the narrow lane, her footsteps slow, her heart beating faster with each step. At the gate, she paused, listening for any sound from within. There was nothing. Not a voice, not a footstep, not even the creak of a floorboard. She called out, her voice tentative. "Lizzie? Nora? James?" The words hung in the air, unanswered. Mrs. Callahan hesitated, glancing up and down the street, hoping someone else might appear, someone braver or more certain. But the lane was empty, the world holding its breath. She tried the gate, found it unlatched, and pushed it open with a soft groan. The garden was still, the flowers drooping in the heat. She made her way to the front door, her hand trembling as she knocked. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and hollow. She waited, listening, her breath shallow. No one came. Mrs. Callahan knocked again, louder this time, her knuckles stinging. Still there was only silence. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any sign of life. The quiet inside was complete, unnatural. She stepped back, uncertain, her mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps Lizzie had taken the children out. Perhaps they were visiting a neighbor. Perhaps there was nothing to fear. But the unease would not leave her. She circled the house, peering into the windows, shading her eyes against the glare. The curtains in the parlor were drawn tight, the glass reflecting only her own anxious face. She moved to the kitchen window where she could just make out the edge of the table, the neat row of chairs, the empty hearth. Everything was in its place, untouched. She called out again, her voice cracking. "Lizzie, are you there?" The only answer was the distant sound of a cart on the next street, the clatter fading quickly. Mrs. Callahan stood for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest, her breath coming fast. She thought of Nora and James, their small faces pressed to the window, their laughter ringing through the yard. She thought of Lizzie, her careful smile, her quiet strength. At last, Mrs. Callahan made her decision. She hurried back down the lane, her skirts brushing the dusty path, and knocked on Mr. Doyle's door. He answered quickly, concern already etched on his face. She explained in a rush, the silence, the unanswered knocks, the drawn curtains. Mr. Doyle listened, his brow furrowed, and nodded. Together they returned to the O'Leary house. Mr. Doyle knocked, his fist heavy on the wood. When there was no reply, he tried the handle. The door was locked. He looked at Mrs. Callahan, her eyes wide with fear, and then at the window beside the door. With a quiet apology, he forced the latch and pushed the window open, the frame groaning in protest. He climbed inside, his movements slow and careful. Mrs. Callahan waited on the step, her hands twisting in her apron, her breath held tight in her chest. She heard Mr. Doyle's footsteps on the floorboards, the creak of a door opening, the soft thud of something dropped. Then nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Callahan called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Doyle." There was no answer. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. She wanted to run, to call for help, to pretend she had never come to the house at all. At last, Mr. Doyle reappeared at the window, his face ashen, his eyes wide with shock. He did not speak, only shook his head, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. Mrs. Callahan stepped back, her knees weak, her heart pounding. She knew, without being told, that something terrible had happened inside the O'Leary home. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion, their voices hushed, their faces pale. Someone ran for the police, their footsteps echoing down the lane. Mrs. Callahan stood in the garden, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the closed door. The silence that had haunted the house all morning now spilled out into the street, settling over the crowd like a shroud. No one spoke. No one dared to move. They waited, breathless, for the door to open, for someone to explain the horror that had crept into their quiet lane. But the only answer was the silence, deep and unbroken, that lingered in the air. The police arrived in a cluster of dark uniforms, their boots heavy on the lane's packed earth. The crowd parted for them, neighbors stepping back, their faces drawn and anxious. The officers exchanged brief, quiet words with Mr. Doyle, who stood by the open window, his hands shaking, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Mrs. Callahan hovered nearby, her lips pressed white, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold in the cold that had settled over her. Sergeant Malloy was the first to enter, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He paused just inside the door, taking in the hush that filled the house. The other officers followed, their movements careful, their voices low. They spread out through the small rooms, their footsteps muffled by the worn rugs, their eyes searching every corner. The parlor was still, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something that made the men slow their steps, their faces tightening. One officer stopped at the threshold, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his breath caught in his throat. Another moved to the kitchen, his eyes darting from the empty table to the neat row of chairs, to the untouched breakfast dishes. Sergeant Malloy called softly for Lizzie, for the children, his voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. He moved deeper into the house, his hand resting on the wall for balance. The officers followed, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They found the children's toys scattered on the floor, a doll's arm peeking from beneath a chair. They found Nora's small shoes by the hearth, James's wooden blocks stacked in a careful tower. In the back room, the officers paused. The door was closed, the air behind it colder, heavier. Sergeant Malloy reached for the handle, his fingers trembling just slightly. He opened the door, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The others crowded behind him, their faces tense, their bodies rigid with dread. What they saw inside the room was not spoken of in detail. The officers' faces told the story, the way their eyes widened, the way their mouths tightened, the way one man turned away, pressing his fist to his lips. Sergeant Malloy stood very still, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the far wall. He spoke only once, his voice low and strained. "No one is to come in here," he said. "Not until the doctor arrives." The men backed out of the room, closing the door behind them. They stood in the narrow hallway, their shoulders hunched, their hands shaking. One officer leaned against the wall, his face gray, his eyes closed. Another stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. Outside, the crowd waited, their whispers growing louder, their questions sharper. Mrs. Callahan clung to the gate, her eyes searching the faces of the men as they emerged. Mr. Doyle stood beside her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. No one dared to ask what had been found. The silence from the house was answer enough. The doctor arrived, his bag swinging at his side, his face grave. He spoke quietly with Sergeant Malloy, who nodded, his expression unreadable. The doctor entered the house, the door closing softly behind him. The officers remained in the hallway, their voices hushed, their movements slow. They spoke in fragments, their words heavy with what they had seen. One officer, younger than the rest, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "The children," he whispered, his voice breaking. Another placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what comfort he could. Sergeant Malloy stood apart, his gaze fixed on the closed door, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of duty. The doctor emerged after a time, his face pale, his hands trembling. He spoke quietly with the sergeant, his words lost to the crowd outside. Sergeant Malloy nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. He turned to the officers, his voice steady but low. "We'll need to speak to everyone who knew the family. No one leaves until we have their names." The officers moved through the crowd, their questions gentle, their eyes searching. Mrs. Callahan answered in a whisper, her hands twisting in her apron. Mr. Doyle spoke quietly, his voice flat, his eyes distant. The neighbors gathered close, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They spoke of Lizzie's kindness, of the children's laughter, of the quiet life the family had led. Inside the house, the silence remained, thick and unyielding. The rooms seemed smaller now, the air heavier. The officers moved carefully, their footsteps slow, their voices barely more than a murmur. They gathered what they could, small details, quiet memories, the last traces of a family that had vanished into the hush. As evening fell, the crowd began to drift away, their faces shadowed, their voices low. The O'Leary house stood silent, its windows dark, its door closed. The officers remained, their vigil unbroken, their thoughts heavy with what they had seen. The horror of the day lingered in the air, a weight that would not lift, a silence that would not break. As dusk settled over the lane, the officers' questions turned to the people who had moved through the O'Leary home in recent months. The name that surfaced again and again was Mr. Hanley, the boarder. He had lived in the small back room for nearly a year, paying his rent on time, keeping mostly to himself. Some neighbors remembered him as polite, even gentle, but others spoke of a restlessness in his manner, a way of glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to call his name. Mr. Hanley had not been seen since the morning of the murders. Mrs. Callahan recalled watching him leave, his hat pulled low, his coat buttoned tight despite the summer heat. He had paused at the gate, looking back at the house for a long moment before disappearing down the lane. She remembered thinking he seemed troubled, but she had not given it much thought at the time. Now, the memory pressed in on her, heavy and insistent. The officers gathered what they could about him. He was a man of few words, rarely joining the family for supper, often returning late and leaving early. Lizzie had spoken of him only in passing, describing him as quiet, but no trouble. Nora and James had been shy around him, their voices dropping to whispers when he passed through the parlor. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors heard footsteps in the O'Leary house long after the lamps had been extinguished. They assumed it was Mr. Hanley, restless in his small room. Sergeant Malloy sent 2 men to search for him, their instructions clear: find the boarder, bring him in, and ask him what he knew. The officers moved through the city's boarding houses and taverns, showing his likeness, asking after his habits. Some said he had been seen near the docks, others claimed he had taken a train out of the city. No one could say for certain. Back at the O'Leary house, the officers sifted through Mr. Hanley's belongings. His room was spare: a narrow bed, a battered trunk, a few shirts folded neatly in a drawer. There were no letters, no photographs, nothing to suggest a life beyond the walls of the house. On the small table by the window, they found a book of prayers, its pages worn thin, and a single silver coin, polished smooth by years of handling. Sergeant Malloy stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the empty bed. He asked Mrs. Callahan if she had ever seen Mr. Hanley angry, if she had ever heard raised voices from the back room. She shook her head, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. He was always quiet, Sergeant. Always polite. I never saw him quarrel with Lizzie. Not once. Other neighbors echoed her words, but there were small things they remembered now, things that seemed to matter in the wake of tragedy. Mr. Doyle recalled seeing Mr. Hanley standing in the yard late at night, staring up at the house, his face hidden in shadow. Miss O'Rourke, who lived across the lane, remembered a time when Nora had run from the house in tears, Mr. Hanley's voice following her, low and urgent. She had thought little of it then, but now the memory unsettled her. The officers pieced together what they could, their questions circling back to the boarder again and again. Why had he left so early that morning? Why had he not returned? What had he seen or done before the silence fell over the O'Leary home? As the night deepened, the search for Mr. Hanley grew more urgent. The officers' voices grew sharper, their movements more hurried. The neighbors watched from their windows, their faces pale in the lamplight, their eyes following every shadow that passed along the lane. Inside the O'Leary house, the rooms remained unchanged. The children's toys lay scattered on the floor, Lizzie's shawl draped over the back of a chair, the last traces of ordinary life untouched by the horror that had come. The officers moved quietly through the house, their footsteps soft, their voices low, as if afraid to disturb the silence that lingered in every corner. The boarder's absence became a presence of its own, a question that would not be answered, a shadow that stretched across every conversation. The O'Leary family was gone, and the only man who might have known why had vanished into the city's darkness, leaving behind only silence and suspicion. The search for Mr. Hanley stretched into the following day, the city's shadows growing longer as officers moved from boarding house to boarding house, asking after the quiet man with the careful manners. Each inquiry was met with a shake of the head, a shrug, or a memory that seemed to shift with the telling. Some said he had spoken of leaving Boston. Others insisted he had been seen at the docks, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The truth was slippery, always just out of reach. At the station, Sergeant Malloy sat with Mrs. Callahan and Mr. Doyle, their faces drawn, their hands restless in their laps. He asked them again about the morning of the murders, about Mr. Hanley's habits, about anything that might have seemed unusual. Mrs. Callahan's voice was thin, her words careful. He was quiet, Sergeant. He never raised his voice, but he watched, always watched. Sometimes I'd find him standing in the yard, just looking at the house. I thought he was lonely. Mr. Doyle nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He kept to himself, paid his rent, never caused trouble. But there was something about him, a way he had of listening, as if he was waiting for something to happen. He hesitated, then added, "I never saw him with the children. Not really. He'd nod to them, but that was all." When Mr. Hanley was finally found, it was in a boarding house near the edge of the city, his bag already packed. He did not resist when the officers arrived. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes steady but tired. He answered their questions with the same quiet courtesy he had shown in the O'Leary home. At the station, the questioning began in earnest. Sergeant Malloy's voice was measured, his questions precise. "Where were you on the morning of August 12th? Mr. Hanley replied, "I left early, as I always do. I had work at the docks." His voice was calm, but his hands twisted the brim of his hat, the gesture betraying a tremor of unease. "Did you see Mrs. O'Leary or the children before you left?" Malloy pressed. Mr. Hanley shook his head. "No, sir. The house was quiet. I didn't want to wake them." He looked down, his eyes shadowed. "I heard nothing. I saw nothing." The officers compared his answers to those of the neighbors. There were small inconsistencies. The time he claimed to have left, the direction he said he walked, the work he said he had. Mrs. Callahan remembered seeing him pause at the gate, looking back at the house. Mr. Hanley insisted he had not. Mr. Doyle thought he had heard footsteps in the hallway after Hanley left, but he could not be sure. The strain in the room grew with each question. Mr. Hanley's voice grew softer, his answers shorter. He denied any quarrel with Lizzie, denied any knowledge of what had happened in the house. "I kept to myself," he repeated, his eyes fixed on the table. "I never meant any harm." The officers pressed him about his hurried departure, about the bag packed and ready. Mr. Hanley hesitated, then said, "I was planning to leave. I'd found work elsewhere. I told Mrs. O'Leary I might be gone by the end of the week." But no one remembered hearing him say this. The words hung in the air, uncertain, unprovable. Other acquaintances were questioned as well. The grocer, Mr. Doyle, Mrs. Callahan, each told their story, their voices growing strained as the hours passed. The smallest details were examined, the simplest memories turned over and over, looking for something that might explain the horror that had come to the O'Leary home. but the truth remained elusive. The boarder's story was thin, but not impossible. The neighbors' memories were sharp but not certain. The officer's questions circled back again and again, but the answers never quite fit together. As night fell, Sergeant Malloy sat alone in his office, the lamplight flickering over his notes. He read through the statements, searching for the thread that would tie it all together. Outside, the city was quiet. The lane where the O'Leary house stood darker than ever. Inside the station, the silence was heavy, broken only by the scratch of Malloy's pen and the distant sound of footsteps in the hall. The case was no closer to resolution. The boarder's face, pale and tired, lingered in the minds of all who had questioned him. The neighbors' voices, uncertain and strained, echoed in the empty rooms of the O'Leary home. And the silence that had fallen over the house remained, deep and unbroken, as if waiting for someone to speak the truth aloud. The inquest was held in a small wood-paneled room above the police station, the air close and heavy with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat. Word had spread quickly, and by the time the proceedings began, a crowd had gathered in the hallway, their voices hushed, their faces tense with anticipation. Inside, the officials sat in a row, their expressions grave, their eyes fixed on the witnesses who would be called to speak. Sergeant Malloy was the first to testify. He stood straight, his hands folded behind his back, his voice steady as he described the scene in the O'Leary home. He spoke of the silence, the drawn curtains, the untouched breakfast dishes. He did not linger on what he had seen in the back room. His words were careful, his tone measured. The officials listened, their faces impassive, their pens scratching quietly across the page. Mrs. Callahan was called next. She entered the room with her shoulders hunched, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands twisted in her lap as she recounted the morning's unease, the unanswered knocks, the decision to fetch Mr. Doyle. Her voice faltered when she spoke of the children, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet weeping. The officials waited, their faces softening just slightly before urging her to continue. Mr. Doyle's testimony was brief, his words clipped and precise. He described forcing the window, stepping into the stillness of the house, the dread that grew with every step. He did not look up as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the floor, his voice growing quieter as he recalled the moment he realized something was terribly wrong. Then came Mr. Hanley. He entered the room with his hat in his hands, his eyes downcast. He answered each question with the same quiet courtesy he had shown in the O'Leary home. He repeated his story. He had left early. He had heard nothing. He had seen nothing. When asked about his hurried departure, he explained again that he had found work elsewhere, that he had planned to leave by week's end. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled, the knuckles white against the brim of his hat. The officials pressed him gently, their questions circling back to the morning of the murders, to his relationship with Lizzie and the children. Had there been any quarrels? Any disagreements? Mr. Hanley shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No, sir. Mrs. O'Leary was always kind to me. I never had cause to quarrel with her. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the questioning continued. Some in the crowd leaned forward, their eyes narrowed, searching Mr. Hanley's face for any sign of guilt. Others whispered to one another, their voices low, their words lost in the hush. The officials exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Other witnesses were called, neighbors, acquaintances, the grocer who had seen Lizzie at the market the day before. Each spoke of the O'Leary family's quiet life, of Lizzie's devotion to her children, of the boarder's reserved manner. No one could recall a single moment of anger, a single raised voice, a single threat. As the afternoon wore on, the officials conferred in low voices, their heads bent together over the notes. The crowd in the hallway grew restless, their whispers swelling and fading like the tide. Inside the room, the air grew heavier, the silence deeper. At last, the officials addressed the room. Their words were careful, their tone somber. There was not enough evidence, they said, to bring charges. The boarder's story, though thin, could not be disproved. The neighbor's memories, though sharp, were not certain. The case would remain open, but for now, there would be no arrest. A murmur swept through the room, a mixture of relief and frustration. Some shook their heads, their faces tight with anger. Others looked away, their eyes shining with unshed tears. Mr. Hanley stood, his shoulders slumped, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He did not look at anyone as he left the room, his footsteps slow and heavy on the stairs. The officials gathered their papers, their faces drawn with fatigue. The witnesses drifted out, their voices low, their eyes avoiding one another. The crowd in the hallway dispersed, their questions unanswered, their fears unquieted. The inquest was over, but the silence that had settled over the O'Leary home remained, deep and unbroken. The truth, whatever it was, had slipped away, leaving only questions and the memory of a family lost to the hush of an August morning. After the inquest, the city's attention began to drift, as it always does. The O'Leary house stood unchanged, its windows dark, its garden overgrown, the laughter of children replaced by the hush of rumor. The boarder, Mr. Hanley, was released. There were no charges, no trial, only the echo of questions that would not be answered. Neighbors watched him go with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Some crossed the street to avoid him, their eyes averted, their conversations falling silent as he passed. Others whispered that he had been treated unfairly, that the police had found no proof, that perhaps the horror in the O'Leary home was the work of someone else entirely. But the whispers never reached Mr. Hanley's ears. He left the city soon after, his belongings packed into a single battered case, his figure shrinking into the distance until he was only a memory. Mrs. Callahan lingered at her window, her gaze fixed on the empty house. She could not bring herself to enter, not even to collect the toys that still lay scattered in the yard. She spoke less to her neighbors, her voice softer, her eyes shadowed by what she had seen. Mr. Doyle returned to his shop, but his hands shook when he counted change, and he locked his doors earlier each night. The police came less often as the weeks passed. Sergeant Malloy visited once or twice, standing in the garden, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the closed door. He spoke to no one, and when he left, he did so quietly, his footsteps fading into the evening. The case file grew thin, the notes gathering dust in a drawer, the names and dates blurring with time. In the neighborhood, frustration grew. Some demanded answers, gathering in small groups to discuss the case, their voices rising in anger and fear. Others simply turned away, unwilling to dwell on what could not be changed. The O'Leary house became a place to avoid, its silence a warning, its story a shadow that stretched across the lane. Children no longer played near the gate. The garden grew wild, the flowers choked by weeds, the path lost beneath a tangle of grass. The curtains remained drawn, the rooms inside untouched, the air heavy with the memory of what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, a light would flicker in an upstairs window, a trick of the moon, or perhaps the restless spirit of a family that had never truly left. The city moved on, as cities do. New families came and went. New stories took root in the narrow lanes and crowded markets. But for those who had known the O'Learys, the silence in that house was a wound that would not heal. The questions lingered, unanswered and unanswerable, growing fainter with each passing year. And so the case faded, not with resolution, but with forgetting. The boarder's name was spoken less and less, the children's laughter remembered only in dreams. The O'Leary home remained, its door closed, its story unfinished, the silence inside deeper than ever. The O'Leary home was never the same after that day. The rooms remained, but the voices were gone. And in Boston's memory, the door to that house has never truly closed. Years passed, and the lane changed around the house. Paint peeled from the clapboards, the garden surrendered to wildness, and the windows gathered dust. Yet the house itself endured, a silent witness to the morning when time seemed to stop. Neighbors grew old and moved away, but the story lingered, whispered by those who remembered the hush that fell and never lifted. Sometimes a new family would move in, drawn by the low rent and the promise of a quiet street. They would last a season, maybe two, before the silence became too much. They spoke of uneasy dreams, of footsteps in empty rooms, of a chill that crept through the halls even in summer. The children, if there were any, would not play in the yard. They would stand at the window, watching the lane, as if waiting for someone to return. Mrs. Callahan lived out her days in the house next door, her hair turning silver, her steps growing slow. She kept her curtains drawn, her gaze fixed on the O'Leary home. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, she would think she heard Lizzie's voice, soft and distant, calling the children in for supper. She would rise and look out, but the house would be dark, the garden empty, the silence unbroken. Sergeant Malloy retired, his name fading from the city's memory. He never spoke of the O'Leary case again, but sometimes he would walk past the house, his hat in his hands, his eyes lingering on the closed door. He would pause, as if listening for something, then move on, his footsteps echoing in the quiet lane. The boarder, Mr. Hanley, was never seen in Boston again. Some said he started a new life far away. Others believed he carried the weight of suspicion with him wherever he went. His name became a caution, a shadow in the stories told to children on restless nights. Inside the O'Leary house, the rooms stood as they had on that August morning. The toys remained in their box, the shawl draped over the chair, the breakfast dishes still stacked neatly on the shelf. Dust settled on every surface, softening the edges of memory, but nothing was ever truly forgotten. The city grew and changed, but the O'Leary home endured, a quiet scar on the lane. The story of Lizzie and her children became a part of Boston's bones, a sorrow passed from one generation to the next. The silence inside the house was not just the absence of voices, but the presence of all that was left unsaid. And so, the door to that house has never truly closed. It stands, even now, in the city's memory, a threshold between what was and what might have been, between the living and the lost. The O'Leary family's story lingers in the hush of summer afternoons, in the shadows that gather at dusk, in the hearts of those who remember. The rooms remain, but the voices are gone. And in Boston's memory, the door to that house has never truly closed. Thank you for listening, and for keeping company with the memory of Lizzie O'Leary and her children. Their story lingers in the quiet places, in the questions that were never answered, in the silence that still hangs over that house. If this story has moved you, or if you have thoughts about what happened in the O'Leary home, we invite you to share them. What do you believe became of Mr. Hanley? Do you see echoes of this case in your own city, your own history? You can leave a comment, send us a message, or share your reflections with others who are listening from around the world. Your voices help keep these stories alive and remind us that the past is never as distant as it seems. Until next time, keep your lights burning and listen for the stories that linger in the quiet.